So I found a site that has the number of passports issued by state, and I thought, oh, I can add this to the data I already have on US states. So I did that. And the first thing I found made is let's start with this nice 3D chart. So I'm comparing the vote that Biden got in each state to its GDP per capita compared to the number of passports each state has. As we can see, we have a pretty nice positive correlation here. Poorer states tend to be more Republican, which tend to have fewer passports, and vice versa. Up here in our top left corner, we have New York, Massachusetts, California. Lots of passports, high income, very democratic. New Jersey leads the pack at the most passports per person. And then Maryland, Colorado, Connecticut, Washington State. Washington is surprisingly low for a Democratic state with such income, and I think this might be because Washington has the enhanced driver's license, which allows Washington state residents to get that instead of a passport if we want to go to Canada. So that's probably why Washington's a little lower. These other states are still Democratic, but you can see a clear trend. You have a few outliers here: Nebraska, North Dakota, and Wyoming, pretty Republican, but they have higher incomes than one would expect. But still, they have a pretty low passport numbers per person issued. Alaska has more passports. I think this is because of its isolation. If you want to fly back to the States, it's back to the mainland, the contiguous United States. Passport just makes it easier if you need to transfer through Canada. Utah, interestingly enough, has is an interesting one because they have a decent income, lots of passports, on par with New York or California almost. And I think this is because of, being a heavily Mormon state. A lot of Mormons are traveling abroad, so that means they have more passports than another state with its partisan affiliation is so Republican. Um, Here we have Idaho, again, heavily Mormon state, pretty low income relatively, but again, like 60,000 still not terrible by a global perspective. By US is pretty bad. Very Republican, but still pretty high passports per capita, despite having an income on par with that of Kentucky. So I think just because Idaho has a lot of Mormons, they end up with a lot more passports you would expect otherwise. We have our states in the middle here, and there you go. So what I did is I then mapped it out using Inkscape. And here you can see very clearly you have your dark blue is clearly your rich democratic states with lots of passports. There are no rich democratic states with few passports, and I think that is interesting. The next group are rich Republican states with lots of passports, and those are orange. The aforementioned Utah and Alaska, but also Nebraska and Texas. Texas has been seeing a lot of population growth with people moving there from Democratic states. Also, Texas is a lot more competitive compared to how it was in the past. So you end up with Texas being having a higher passport rate than other Republican states. At least that's my hypothesis. And then you have our poor, and those are it for rich states in the country. You have you also have some rich Republican states with few passports: Wyoming, the Dakotas, Iowa, Kansas. These states have less technology. They're a lot more salt of the earth, lots of oil, mining, and farms. And so these states are interesting because these are your salt of the earth Americans. Nebraska, however, stands out among the pack with more passports than one would expect. It is a wealthy state, especially as Republican states go. And Nebraska really stands out because if you look at its partisan affiliation or other statistics, you generally would think, Nebraska is probably, more like Missouri. But economically, it's closer to that of Colorado or Minnesota. So Nebraska is a weird state in a lot of respects statistically. Moving on, we now have our poor Democratic states. We have only one which is a poor Democratic state with lots of passports, and that's Rhode Island. Rhode Island is interesting. Their income's lower than other states in the region, very urban state, but for some reason their income is slightly below average, but not by that much. Then you have Michigan, Vermont, Maine, and New Mexico have fewer passports. Incomes in Vermont and Maine are significantly lower than you find in the rest of New England, for whatever reason. more rural states, but that doesn't fully explain it because you look compared to New Hampshire. Michigan is, of course, Rust Belt. It's only recently it's been mostly Democratic for a while, but it's become pretty swingy. New Mexico is the poorest Democratic state of the bunch, so it's not surprising that both New Mexico, the poorest Democratic state, and Nebraska, the richest Republican state, are both outliers. Um, Moving on to your poor Republican states, you have some that you have some interesting ones here. So Arizona, Georgia, and Florida are probably pulled up because they have a large divide. Same with Pennsylvania. These four states they're really swing states. Florida should be more of a swing state than it is, and so that leads it to be really interesting. You have that north-south divide in Florida, where the North is more like the former Confederate states, the rest of them, and southern Florida is a lot of retirees from New York City. Georgia, you have Atlanta, Philadelphia, Arizona, you have Phoenix, and that probably drags their passport numbers up. Idaho, you again have a large Mormon population, and Montana, to quote my friend who lives in Bozeman, is a weird state. You have a few of these states in the middle don't really fit in with the trends overall. Montana's, of course, has voted in a lot of Democratic senators, but hasn't voted for the Democratic for president for a while. Um, it's elected a lot of Democratic governors. Montana's weird. And then finally, you have your few passport Republican poor states, which are mostly in the deep south, along with Indiana, Ohio, and Wisconsin. Um, and this is all relative to other states. So I think this is really interesting how you can see that again. And one thing when I look at this is I like to make a dictionary. And as you see here, you can really see the concentration that low income Republican, few passports, and high income Democratic with many passports are your two largest groups of states, with a bunch of states scattered in the middle. I hit these thresholds as close to the median as I could, and you see a clear trend that the three go together. I then did a simple correlation, not too fancy statistics here, just a correlation on everything from passports per capita. Not surprising, if you have more people who smoke, you tend to have less income, fewer passports. Funny, like the more Republican your state, the less likely you are to have a passport. And down here we find the best predictor is GDP per capita at 94% correlation coefficient. And then income per capita, which is basically the same. Bachelor's degrees, basically the same. Education, democratic. And lower homicide rate, actually. It tends to have more passports. Let's see. Other graphs I have, we have this graph I showed you. Here's your Idaho and Utah, forever outliers because of their Mormon population, I believe. Montana, Alaska, your western states essentially really break the mold. So if you eliminate these states, you then have a clear trend line. You also have Vermont is very interesting, Hawaii, New Mexico, Maine, Michigan. And then your general trend down here, West Virginia, which of course their motto is "Thank God for Mississippi," and your Appalachian states along with Alabama, and then up here we have our rich Democratic states, Delaware, wealthy Democratic, fewer passports than other similarly wealthy Democratic states. Again, Delaware's income has increased rapidly because a lot of corporations are headquartered there but don't really do much business there besides the tax haven status. New York, Massachusetts, California. No surprises here. So that's interesting. I have a graph here that shows GDP per capita versus on the 2D, same as we saw earlier with looking at border status. It doesn't appear that being a border state has a major impact on having lots of passports, as we see here. But it's clearly not an important factor. we're testing for political partisan affiliation. And as we know, there is a clear trend. You have these four outliers down here, but in general, and then your Western outliers up here, you tend to find Democratic states have more passports and higher income than Republican states, with only a few outliers. Um, Here is your histogram of passports per capita. Nice peak here between a quarter and a third, which is a little lower than I would like. And then finally, this is the same graph, just not color coded. No, this is not the same graph. This is Biden vote versus passports per capita, and we do see a clear trend line here. New Jersey up top, as with most passports, over 50% based on this data, extrapolating it, assuming those are normal numbers. Utah, Idaho, your Mormon states. But once you get rid of your Mormon states and Wyoming, you really find you have very few outliers. You have few Democratic outliers of Vermont, which is lower income, and Hawaii. But the rest, aside from those 5 states, you have a really nice trend where Biden vote leads to more passports. And you also find here um, really strong correlation between income and passport ownership, which is kind of cool. So, yeah, I think that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. And I think it's interesting looking at partisan affiliation, income, and how many Americans travel. One question I have is if you had more, like if you wanted these states to, become wealthier, if they started making more money, if they had better economies, would they start voting Democratic more? Or if they started voting Democratic, would their economies improve? That is one question, which I need to analyze more often. If they started to travel more, would they get more perspective and stop being so heavily Republican? If they became wealthier, would that lead to more travel, lead to more liberal viewpoints? It's hard to tell. I would need a you know uh, time based analysis, but this is using a lag. But this is quite interesting, and I hope you enjoyed that. Oh yeah, I bet that's because a lot of African Americans in Mississippi. Anyways, so they have a higher Biden vote than their income and passports would predict in Mississippi. Yeah, lots of interesting data on this chart. Hope you enjoyed. Have a great day.